Now I'd like to welcome our first keynote speaker, Professor Jenny Phillimore from University of Birmingham. Jenny is a prolific, obviously, researcher professor of migration and superdiversity. She holds a chair in migration and superdiversity at the University of Birmingham within the Department of Social Policy, Sociology, and Criminology. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, as well as the Academy of Social Sciences in UK, and she leads the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham as well. Jenny is a world-leading scholar in refugee integration, superdiversity, and access to social welfare, with a particular focus on public health. We're really happy, we're gratified that she accepted our invitation to give us our first keynote speech today. I will be introducing our other keynote speakers, with the same gratification over the next few days, obviously. We are truly impressed with her work and very much interested in hearing her keynote speech this morning. So without further talking, I'd like to open the floor to our first keynote speech today. And I'd like to welcome you once again to your homes, but nonetheless to Glaswegian heart. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Umut. A really nice introduction. I should just point out that I'm no longer the director of the Institute for Research into Superdiversity. I've moved into a new role on the REF sub-panel, which is about to get quite hectic. So today I'm going to be talking about the UK's indicators of integration for refugees. And I, with several other people, but particularly Alison Strang and Linda Morris, was a co-author of these indicators, which were written for the UK's Home Office, and it was a process of 3 years. So I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into the process, but also particularly into the principles on which the indicators are framed. So you'll get a critical reflection today, and this is based on a piece of work that Alison, Linda and myself are working on, so credit to them. I'm talking, but we did this together. And I'll be trying to do it quite quickly. Right now, can I move my screen? Yes, that's good. Okay, so what will I cover? I'm aware that you're from all kinds of places, so there'll be a brief, very brief bit of context about refugees in the UK. Then I'll move on to the indicators of integration, what they are and what they're used for. I'll outline the 4 key principles. I'll take them one at a time and talk about, kind of a little bit about the ideas behind them, but also some sort of critical thinking around these principles, particularly in relation to immigration and asylum policy. And then I will conclude. So the main tension going on today is the indicators of integration on one hand, which is this fantastic document that's all singing, all dancing, really comprehensive, focusing on multiple parties, which is produced by the Home Office, and asylum and immigration policy, which is produced by the Home Office. So one department, 2 different ways of thinking, and the incongruence about that. Okay, so refugees in the UK. In the last few years, around 30,000 asylum seekers per year have arrived in the UK, and about 50% of these eventually gain some kind of refugee status, often after many years of waiting. So the main source of refugees in the UK is in fact the asylum seeking route. And 20 years ago, more than 100,000 people were arriving per annum. The government's now heading to a situation where they're trying to prevent people coming in as asylum seekers at all, eschewing any responsibility under the UNHCR convention. On top of that, we also now have in the UK a refugee resettlement programme. Well, we've had a refugee resettlement programme for many years. It was very small, but this increased in 2015 to 20,000, a target of 20,000 refugees arriving over 5 years, with extensive, well, in relative terms, support offered for integration. So what we see is a bifurcated policy and discourse of what's been described by other scholars and commentators as the kind of good, bad refugee discourse. So there's the hostile environment for asylum seekers, No support for them to integrate once they gain refugee status, so once they've been through quite a horrific determination process, limited leave to remain for them, so they have to reapply after 3, 4, 5 years, and now we have plans afoot to deny asylum based on the way that people enter the UK. On the other hand, we have resettlement support with high levels of administrative and fiscal investment in their integration in comparative terms. Now, the Indicators of Integration document is aimed at all refugees in the UK, regardless of arrival route. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the Indicators of Integration is the only document that discusses what integration might look like for refugees in the UK. There's no strategy and there is no integration policy, unlike many other European states. Now, the Indicators of Integration framework was first introduced in 2004, and it's been so widely used since then. So it's an evidence-based framework underpinned by the work of Alistair Ager and Alison Strang, based on a large piece of research with wide-ranging individuals, policymakers, practitioners, refugees themselves. And the idea of this framework at the time was to help develop local and national strategy. In the UK, integration is predominantly conceived of as being a local activity. The indicators were there to outline what good looks like, to help those who are introducing interventions to support integration, to think about what those integrations should include. And it's an aid of measurement of integration. So firstly, to measure the success of integration initiatives. So evaluations of the European Refugee Fund in the UK have used the framework as their analysis tool, but also to measure the integration outcomes of refugees themselves, or at least in theory, because the data is not good enough, but that's another story. Now, although it is very much UK based and cited and located in UK policy, actually this framework has been implemented across Europe, North America, China, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, 16,000 plus citations. Extraordinary number of citations for a policy document. Okay. So let's move on to what happened around 2019. Well, actually, we have to go 3 years before that. It starts even a little bit earlier in 2015 with the so-called refugee crisis and the introduction of that new resettlement program in the UK. Basically, there were increased calls for new indicators of integration. At that point, it was over 10 years old. Much had changed. People were coming from new places via new routes, and it was evident that there was a need for an update. So the Home Office started a whole process of consultation, which basically was led by key policymakers within the Home Office and academics from each of the UK's 4 countries. Then the consultation, so we did all the writing, and the consultation involved local authorities, every government department, NGOs, major refugee organisations, big meetings with refugees. So it was a huge consultative process. It was a constant process of negotiation between all of these different parties at a time when we had well, we still have, but there was a very hostile environment and a whole discourse around what integration should look like. So you can imagine it was kind of like a really aggressive game of tennis with balls going backwards and forwards really fast all the time, and sometimes people hitting them harder and harder trying to score a point. And the 3 of us kind of got caught in the middle of this, but actually were able to be a moderating influence, we hope. Now, it consists of 4 domains, which I'll show you in a sec, and each domain has multiple indicators, all of which can be measured. And going far beyond the 2004 document, each indicator can be connected to measurement instruments in a toolkit, so you can kind of click on it and it'll show you all the different questions you can use from different surveys and different data sources. It's very technical now, There's a whole list of local and national good practice in each indicator areas, pointing on different sets of responsibilities: national government, local government, media, host society, as well as refugees. There's a theory of change document, and then there's another document that documents what works in integration. So what's the evidence about what works in integration? So there's a whole suite of tools. Today, I'm just going to focus on the indicators themselves. Now, the indicators were underpinned by 4 principles. And essentially, these indicators, it's a framework of aspiration. We set out the indicators, we set out the good practice based on the ideal. This is what we're hoping would be put in place. We're not saying the money's there. We're certainly not saying the political kind of willingness to pursue all of these is there, but it's all there in one place after this process of negotiation. So I'm going to go through what the 4 principles are, and I'm going to ask the key thing I'm focusing on today is, well, how do these aspirations connect with the reality in the UK? So as I've said already, this is produced by the Home Office, on this kind of integration, asylum, support side. But on the other hand, you've got another side of the Home Office, which is in charge of introducing this and maintaining and pushing for this hostile environment. So the reality of asylum and refugee policy. So let's start with the first principle, which is multidimensionality. And I've put a copy of the indicator framework here for you to look at. You can see that there are 4 domains: markers, means, social connections, facilitators and foundations. And each of those bubbles is a set of indicators. The different colours are, the blue ones were introduced for 2019, so they're brand new, and the brown ones, or the beigey ones, are sort of a slight change in existing ones, or a bigger change and a movement around. The first thing to point out is that there is no hierarchy here. There was never intended to be a hierarchy. The initial indicators of integration looked like there was, but no one indicator has priority over others. And what we state is that there are multiple and interacting factors. So different combinations, different dimensions, different aspects of integration matter for different people at different times, and they evolve over time. This is not something that's fixed. A diagram has to be fixed, but the reality is something a lot more fluid. Okay. So we also argue that focusing on one domain does not measure integration. And we are particularly making these statements because all the emphasis in the UK tends to be on either employment or language acquisition. So this kind of focus on employment has been shown to be quite problematic. The push to get refugees into employment as soon as possible, whereas the evidence shows that early labour market integration actually impacts on broader integration areas and impacts on people's social mobility in the long term. So Alison Strang did some work with the Chinese refugee community in Glasgow, long-standing community. And, these are held up as being this wonderful model of integration. But on closer examination, they find that, activity in the labour market is really high, but people are stuck in low-skilled, low-wage employment, not having had the opportunity to learn the language, not having had the opportunity to build the social networks they need to be socially mobile. So around multidimensionality, this is a complex idea, and in terms of kind of the empirical work that underpins multidimensionality, what we're unable to do at the moment is to identify the patterns that support better outcomes. So that's definitely on the research agenda for the future, and to establish whether there are any kind of generalizable causal relationships between the different indicators. But one thing's for sure, it's multidimensional and it's not static. So the second principle, this is of multidimensionality. Very, very keen within the indicators to point to the lack of linearity in integration processes. Now, integration is frequently conceived, particularly by policymakers, as a process with an endpoint. And the endpoint, more historically than perhaps the way we talk about things nowadays, is that refugees or migrants would kind of disappear into the general population, and that would be the end of it. You could say they are integrated, but reality suggests something quite different, and that is that integration is a moving target. It's a constant negotiation between hosts and minorities. So the example I give here is the work of Batir and Ram, who focus on the Pakistani origin residents of the USA, first, second, third generation, considered themselves to be American after 9/11. Their kind of Muslim religion was problematized, and they were suddenly treated as other when they'd only ever considered themselves to be American. And with the rise of Islamophobia, experienced racism, experienced quite heightened attention to their identity and questioning of their identity and their loyalty to the US. So integration processes can stagnate, or they can even reverse. You may not even question the issue of integration, but all of a sudden it can reverse. It can move in different directions at different times across different domains or different indicators. So you might be successful in one area, and you might feel that you're really making progress, but in another things can fall apart. And in the UK, unfortunately, we have far too many examples of how integration can reverse. So I'm not sure, I imagine most of you are aware of the Windrush scandal and of course the horrors of Brexit. But we have people who are employed, they speak English, they consider themselves to be fully connected and totally British, but all of a sudden their rights disappear and their access to housing is withdrawn, their access to employment is withdrawn, they can even be deported. People have died because they've been denied access to healthcare. So, it really can move in multiple directions. But also in terms of multidirectionality, there's this question of integration into what? Because the idea has been that you move forward so that you integrate into a majority of community, into receiving society, without a critical discussion of what receiving society looks like. But the work that we've done around super diversity in the UK and Europe shows that society is evolving all the time. It's increasingly super diverse, it's connected transnationally, it's constantly evolving. And then there's the problematization of migration, as if being part of this imagined whole is the ideal, because there's some kind of problem with migration. It's a challenge, and these people are bringing in new ideas, new cultures, new traditions that threaten the pre-existing norm. This idea that everything's already perfect and the problems arrive with migrants. So there's an over-focus on homogenized, imagined national values, and we came up against this when we were preparing the indicators over and over again. The constant desire to put in the words shared values or British values. And, we as academics at the table were able to say, well, what are British values? And there was never an answer for that. No one had a specific set of values that we could point to as something that we all sign up to. So this idea that the majority is homogenous and that, we aren't already diverse, and the idea that change is problematic. And also the idea that, there is only bad change. And of course, this is heavily imbued in what's been going on around Brexit and the idea that we can perhaps go back to what happened before we joined the European Union, where in fact the evidence suggests that oftentimes, not just in the UK, but elsewhere, change is welcomed. And there's some great examples around the introduction of community sponsorship programs in rural areas in the UK, where there was a lot of fear and resistance to the arrival of, this kind of difference. And then when people arrive, there's a change in attitude. So there's talk of the whole area becoming more outward looking, a strengthening community, and more internationalized perspectives. So change can be good, but it's often portrayed as bad. So we talk about multidirectionality in terms of integration can go in different directions, but it can drive a really positive agenda. Okay, so the third one is integration as a shared responsibility. The argument here is that it's a collective responsibility, and that refugees and other migrants can only be integrated in relation to others. Now, Penix and Mascarenhas have said that receiving society holds the greatest power. They're the ones who decides who integrates, who becomes socially connected, and thus they have the greatest responsibility. Yet, a lot of the discourse, particularly in the UK, is around the idea of newcomers and long-established migrants not wanting to be part of society, self-segregating, becoming, living in kind of ethnicized ghettos and expressions like this. This has dominated the discourse in the UK since, well, for many years, but particularly since 2001. Was renewed again in 2016 as well. So we argue within the indicators that the ability to integrate can depend on the presence of enabling and disabling structures and whether or not there's an inclusive and evolving society. So structural factors, the very fact of different approaches to immigration and asylum, can and do on an everyday basis undermine the agency of refugees particularly. So the asylum system and the way that it's set up to presume that anyone who's coming through is a bogus asylum seeker, and the whole system's established to try and disprove asylum claims rather than to provide protection for people who are escaping persecution. The hostile environment, the idea that we try to make every aspect of social policy, even financial services in the UK, hostile to those who don't have a right to arrive to be in the UK, which at the same time affects those who are very much part of life and who have every right to be living in the UK. So, you know, the Windrush situation evolved because of the hostile environment. You know, this expectation that you've got to constantly prove that you have a right to be there. And the kind of presence of the violent uncertainty of waiting and living in a state of liminality, particularly as asylum seekers, who I've already said are the ones who are going to end up being the majority of refugees, waiting sometimes 20 years, unable to work, denied access to education. You know, this will impact on people's eventual ability to integrate if they're not allowed to integrate for so many years. There's a lack of enabling structures, or a kind of, you know, the very presence of disabling structures, a short-termist approach to any integration initiative, the absence of national program support and inappropriate language programs, which are, you know, a problem which has been evident for at least 2 decades and has not been addressed in any way, shape or form. So inclusion can only occur if existing established communities, whoever they are prepared to welcome people. And we have shown very clearly through our analysis of the UK's survey of new refugees that those refugees who experience racism and discrimination actually have poorer health outcomes, both physical and mental health, less likely to be employed, and are likely to be in less secure housing. There's an association, a very clear association between experiences of racism and those other integration domains. So it enhances the kind of idea of multi-directionality, but also multi-dimensionality, and shows the importance of the shared responsibility. And finally, integration is context specific. So very much matters, you know, the kind of nature of the local context. In the UK, it's, you know, kind of the statement is that integration happens at local level. Has to be said, no investment at local level for integration, no additional support to help develop integration programs. And with the introduction of austerity measures in 2008, pretty much everything that was in place got wiped out almost overnight. Sorry, the introduction of austerity measures in 2010. But, you know, even aside that expectation, of course, places are different, very different, and they offer different opportunity structures. They've got different local histories. They've got different local narratives around diversity and migration and different identities. And you see with the good and bad refugee models, 2 types of different local contexts. So In relation to the asylum seekers who eventually become refugees, they are dispersed on a no-choice basis to the areas in the UK that have the cheapest housing and the most available housing, and these are the most deprived of areas. So once they do gain refugee status and the right to work, there's no work to be had, and the resources in those areas are very poor. On the other hand, those good refugees who are resettled as part of community sponsorship in particular are sent to areas where there are high levels of affluence and opportunity. So very different experiences, and those different contexts make a difference. But also population contexts matter, and certainly the populations of refugees who themselves are very heterogeneous, lots of different individual characteristics. And we find, looking at the survey of new refugees, very different outcomes by gender, very different outcomes by ability to speak English in particular. And yet we treat all refugees as they are the same. Each refugee experiences different barriers to and opportunities to integration. So it's a highly complex situation. And I think this is why, we can't really point to any perfect integration programs or any countries where integration is, kind of going really well, because it is so complex and it's also been so politicized. And for us in the UK, there's a very strong relationship between vulnerability and immigration status. So as I've already said, the good, bad refugee, but the experience for asylum seekers in the UK and those who eventually become refugees via that route is pretty horrific. Not only do you wait years, but your claim will fail, you'll be made homeless, you'll be made destitute, then you can put in a new claim, so you're back in the system, you might get housed again, and you might go through this process several times over several years, living with a constant threat of being deported, and often still detained just on the basis that you're a flight risk. Okay, so I'm getting to the end of my rather whistle-stop tour of the principles now. As I've said, the 4 principles are the thing that underpins the whole of the 2019 document and associated documents. And they are intended to represent good practice. They're intended to ensure that refugees have the agency to act, to do what they need to do in order that they feel integrated in the way that matters to them. They also very much stress the shared responsibility. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Within the indicators, we tried to remove all of the contentious language. The terms meaningful mixing and shared values kept coming back to the table, and I kind of have flashbacks to it, but there was a huge table with about 30 people around it, and there would always be at least one person who would say, well, we haven't mentioned meaningful mixing. And then there would be this debate about meaningful mixing and what it meant, and we would manage to get it shifted out, and it's a long document. We'd constantly be looking through it each iteration to see if they'd snuck in meaningful mixing and shared values and other kind of these empty terms which place all of the emphasis on some kind of judgment, value judgment about the way that refugees behave. We haven't achieved the perfect document. We produced this with civil servants, and it had to be signed off by the immigration minister. In fact, it had to be signed off by the Prime Minister on the day before she left office. So that was kind of handy. She was a bit distracted. But the shift of emphasis is very much there. So the responsibility has shifted from refugees to everybody. So we have a national and local good practice section for every indicator. We clearly state the responsibility of national government not to use asylum seekers, refugees, or other migrants for political purposes. Of course, they still are, but the statements are in there. We talk about the role of the media. We look at local good practice, what local authorities can realistically do. We look at the role of local communities, NGOs at different levels. So there's a whole range of different practices there that are empirically founded. So it's all based on evidence for each indicator area. So it provides a bit of support. And the hope is, because there's been a whole training program around this, that those good practices will be implemented over time. There's also, this kind of shifts of emphasis to multiple contexts. But at the end of the day, what we're looking at here is a statement of aspiration. And within this document, although we managed to, change the focus of responsibility and very much embed shared responsibility and context and so on, what we did not manage to achieve was a discussion around the impact of structural constraints. So all of the problems associated with immigration and asylum policy, which are profoundly anti-integrative, there is no doubt about it, and the lack of investment in integration in the UK, there's about to be a small programme, a £10 million programme, but it's kind of tokenistic. None of this is mentioned. So here we have the elephant in the room, and that is immigration and asylum policy. It hangs over this document, but it's never mentioned specifically. We talk about not using refugees for political purposes, but we know that that happens all of the time. So significant progress since 2004 across all of the principles, and an acceptance at that moment when it was written and signed off by the Prime Minister that this is something that the government is signing up to, that the Home Office is signing up to. But what we need to make the integration indicators come into practice is investment to support all of the stakeholders to act on the principles. And this means particularly at local level, because so much emphasis is placed on that, within local communities, not just for refugees, but we've shown through what we can do in community sponsorship that actually engaging with refugees and asylum seekers can be quite transformational within communities in a really, really positive way. And also the need to address the hostile environment, immigration policy, and the way it portrays migrants as criminals, kind of the way that, the kind of hostile border policies, and of course the fallout from Brexit, which unfortunately we're going to be looking at for many, many years. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. I've just, I popped a few resources on there. The second one down is the main document, but if you Google Indicators of Integration 2019, it all pops up. I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. This was an excellent lecture this morning. So may I open the floor for various questions?
I will just start with really basic questions, and thanks, really interesting presentation. After hearing you, how basically you reframe the concept of integration, actually, I was just wondering why you're sticking with the word integration. There's all the debate about whether integration is the correct term to use it for this kind of policy. So I was just wondering, why integration? I usually still speak about integration. We'll use a different term, because when you speak about integration, no matter how you frame it, but I think some people might think something else. Yeah. I know you frame the integration a completely different way, how a lot of people might understand the concept. So I was just wondering why you make this decision.
Well, I mean, actually, theoretically, it does connect well with a lot of the discussions around integration over the last 70 years. But bear in mind, this was a policy process. We're on a path that was already set in 2004. We are not in a position, we don't have the power to turn around and say, okay, integration doesn't work as a word. There's too much associated with it. It's more treated as assimilation than, a shared responsibility. Let's completely reframe this. The way that this happened in the past in the UK was kind of more of an emphasis on community cohesion, which is even more problematic in my mind. So the option to stop using the word integration just wasn't there. It was never on the table. But also, I argue in policy terms now, we're in the situation where, integration has been used for so many years. We can't have this conversation, myself as a social policy analyst, without using that term. It's the only way I can communicate with policymakers. So we're kind of stuck with it, and I want to reframe it, and this is what we've tried to do, is to reframe it so that people still, you know, policymakers can still use it, because they're not going to use any other term, and it's what they think they understand, and we gently reframe it and get them to think about it in different ways and enact policies that actually are much more about their own responsibility.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Soner, would you like to have your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for this comprehensive presentation. So I really like the elephant in the room. So that briefly explains the UK's integration policy. Two questions. What do you think about the recent report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities in terms of new trends in UK's integration policies? Especially, I would like to underline racism is not a real force in the UK, which was emphasized in this report. The second question is about shared responsibility. To continue on that discussion, how do you see neoliberal governance modalities in the UK's integration policy making processes? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. What do I think about the recent race report? Pretty much the same that anyone who knows anything about racism or migration in the UK. It was a complete, well, it's a complete farce. I'm particularly concerned about the new plan for immigration. I don't know if you know about this, but the consultation that's gone out that's going to completely change how we deal with asylum seekers and refugees. I have a project on sexual and gender-based violence and refugees, and you know the horrific experiences that many people have at the hands of the Home Office caseworkers, and the thought that that might get even worse. So I'm particularly concerned that with the new plan for immigration, a whole load of consultation workshops are being held. I don't know if you've come across this. And I'm sitting on the fence at the moment as to whether to attend those workshops or not, because academics who attended one consultation about this race report ended up with their names as being somehow signed up to it. So it's, you know, that even getting involved and trying to shape policy in this space is no longer safe, I don't think. So yeah, the race report is a complete and utter disaster. It doesn't even focus on the state of immigration policy, and you know, I mean, race is just racism is still a huge issue in the UK. So yeah, I mean that's massive, and racism a huge factor in immigration and asylum policy, without a shadow of a doubt. Your second question about shared responsibility and neoliberalism. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there, but whether you're saying that should the government absolve responsibility for integration and make it the responsibility, and shift away from it being the state's responsibility and make it the responsibility of everybody else. In my mind, absolutely not. There's a responsibility to have an integration strategy. If we're going to stick with integration, which we are, it should be there should be investment in that strategy. There should be resources to support people to be able to get on with their lives. I examined a PhD this week looking at VPRS, and you know, that it was very interesting, and that you know, focused on even those good refugees are suffering from neoliberal policies. So, you know, the kind of investment is just not there. It's held over that, you know, local authorities can do it, NGOs can do it, but without any responsibility or investment in them.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Any more? Marcus, you have a question, please?
Sure. Yeah, that was a really interesting talk, Jenny. I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about policymakers trying to push this idea of British values in their policies as well. So we've been mostly looking at the Scotland example and finding very similar up here, which kind of leads to the problem that you outlined about academics being aligned with controversial policies or reports. And I was just wondering if you think that there's what you think the scope is for academics who are not directly involved in the kind of policy process. Do you think it's still useful for people? There are many of us on this call now as critical migration scholars. Is it still useful to be discussing and sharing ideas out with the kind of policy making process itself?
Jenny, if you don't mind, I will have 2 more questions because we have 10 minutes. So perhaps you can just wrap up everything. So Doa.
Yeah, hi, Professor Phillimore. Thank you for your amazing presentation. Actually, my question is quite related with Marcus's one, not the academic side of it, but you underlined the importance of the establishing welcoming communities, the host society, which I completely agree. But while we see the nation-state constructions impacts over the integration policies, which creates a hierarchy between the migrants and the host societies. How can we expect the host society to become more welcoming to migrants? Is it realistic to you?
Thank you very much, Doa. And Alex, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, my question is mostly about the legality of the entire thing, because oftentimes when we see these policies by politicians and policymakers in government, and even in Malta, we notice that the law is oftentimes twisted around in a really weird way, and sometimes cases are lost for such policies when challenged in courts. Is there anything of the sort happening in the UK?
All right, I think 3 questions are good by now. So Jenny, please.
Well, I want to start with the first question, Marcus. Should academics get involved? Oh, yes, we have the evidence. Our knowledge and our evidence, if we don't use it to push against these things, I think things would be worse. I genuinely believe that our use of all of the evidence that many of you produced within this process of putting the indicators of integration together did make a difference. We were able to point to the lack of shared values. We were able to point to evidence using the academic analysis of the Home Office's own data of the damage that racism and anti-migrant discourse does. Okay, it's absolutely critical. And around the new plan, people like Lucy Mablin and others have organised to push back. Every single one of us in the UK should be responding to the new plan. There's a consultation on, and we need to push back really hard. We cannot just sit still and ignore what's going on. So please don't do that. I'm a little bit more fearful than perhaps I was really naive before, and I'm a bit scared about going to these workshops because I do not want my name put on something that supports this new plan. Absolutely not. And I just wonder that, you sit in a room, they talk to you, and then they use your name to try and support something. So I've lost confidence thanks to the race report, but I've already sent in loads of evidence of the damage that our existing immigration and asylum policy do. Welcoming communities, yes, there are hierarchies. Yes, the nation state model is a problem. What do you do about it? I mean, I don't know. I really don't. I've kind of been pushing for years, dismantle the nation state model. But, I'm trying to, there's kind of the blue sky situation and there's the reality. So what we've been doing is looking at what happens at local level. And you see, I've done this big analysis of the evaluation, an independent evaluation of community sponsorship. And you see that these hierarchies can be broken down at local level from the bottom up. Now, I'm not suggesting, nothing works if you only go at it from the bottom up, but let's not just give up on that. So let's still quite chipping away from it above and below. And the last question about law, I didn't quite understand the question, to be honest. But in terms of, there's constant judicial challenges to the government's immigration policy, but the new plan wants to end some of that. So even more reason for you to push back against the new plan. Okay, I hope I've stuck to time. I don't want to ruin your timing right at the very beginning of your 2 days. So
no, actually, we still have 8 more minutes. Do we have any other any further questions? Maybe I can ask a question to Jenny. I mean, you talked about the importance of language teaching. And I wondered actually whether there's an emphasis on linguophobia within the proposed indicators, such as the local accents, and how it can be a dividing factor within societies, such that, I mean, we came across such things in our VOLPOWER interviews, that certain migrant children, well, now they're adolescents, complain that they don't have Scottish accent, and hence, they can never be considered to be integrated, as they lack the local accent. It's something that happens to me, obviously, after having lived in Britain for 10, 11 years. As soon as I'm outside, not having a Scottish accent, I'm already facing this question, like, where are you from, but where are you truly from? So I'm just actually wondering if there's any emphasis on linguophobia within these policy documents.
No, I mean, that's not something we touched on. And to be honest, I've heard about it anecdotally, but not seen any direct evidence, like published evidence that we could have used in the document. So, no.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I have a question from Vegi and then Veronica. Would you like to ask your questions in person?
Veronica's got no audio or video. So
Yes, thank you very much. It was really very interesting presentation. My question is about the role of insiders or the people, because from my own research, my understanding is one of the challenges that refugees, migrants face is lack of interaction with the host community. And it also leads to exclusion, and they really find it difficult on the top of the challenge they have from integration institutions as well. So how do you see that, and what should be done about it?
Okay, what should be done? It's difficult to be prescriptive, but certainly in my own research, most recently this big piece on community sponsorship, where we interviewed over 250 people. One of the things that comes through is refugees trying incredibly hard to connect with neighbours, and neighbours, all they get is the cursory hi bye kind of thing, and not able to build a deeper connection. Now, part of this, we suspected, looking at the overall data set, is a kind of cultural thing, that a lot of these people were like that anyway, according to the local volunteers. They're not massively, it's not a particularly friendly community. People go to work, they come home, they don't want to mix with anybody. So we have to understand that, some people don't want to do that, but there were great examples within community sponsorship of where word of mouth and different events and activities and kind of sustained engagement with community sponsorship had led to kin-like relationships between refugees, volunteers, whole families, multi-generation families. And it seemed to be the opportunity to meet, a safe space, and prolonged exposure to each other. Women, particularly through school, are building those kinds of relationships. So I think you need a space where people interact, which of course we all need when we make friends. I live in a place, I don't know half the people that live here, I'm too busy. But if I end up going to some local events, I might get chatting. And if I go a few more times, maybe I'll end up having coffee with somebody. So I don't see that it's particularly different for refugees or migrants, but we've just got to be open to having those interactions and have the opportunity. Just to say, we're all interacting an awful lot more on social media. And of course, the pandemic has made it very difficult for us to mix, full stop. So I don't know what impact that will have in the long run as well.
I think Veronica's question actually is a written question because she has no access to audio or video. So she says, if there's time, and I realize that there's not much time left, but I mean, she says, if you can share a bit more about your methodology design, particularly the engagement of civil society in the public consultation. Okay,
first to say, it's not my methodology because I didn't run the process. All I could do is influence myself, Alison and Linda. So essentially what happened is at the outset, there were two very large workshops where people were invited from all over the UK with expenses paid, a very generous moment on behalf of the Home Office, So all expenses were paid, and there was a whole load of discussions around structured questions. Should there be new indicators? What's missing? This kind of thing. So it's very multidimensional. Then what happened? You've got kind of 3 years in the middle where we are working on that, pulling in existing evidence bases, developing new indicators, and then kind of they get circulated all the time around the government departments. Finally, there's a draft document. At this stage, there was a series of consultation events, kind of focus groups in each of the devolved nations and in England, where you have one with NGOs, and then after the NGO one, and local authorities, and after that they all invited refugees. So one of the ones that I helped to set up in the West Midlands, I think we had about 50 refugees and asylum seekers attending, commenting on the indicators. And then it was open, sent round. So, you know, like in the same way the new plan for immigration is open for consultation, people could input that way.